My guest tonight is Brandon Martinez. Brandon is an independent writer and journalist from Canada who specializes in foreign policy issues, international affairs, and 20th and 21st century history. For years, he has written on Zionism, Israel-Palestine, American and Canadian foreign policy, war, terrorism, and deception in media and politics. He is the co-founder of Non-Aligned Media and is the author of Grand Deceptions and Hidden History. Brandon's blog is martinezperspective.com. Brandon, how you doing tonight?
Doing well.
Sorry, that's your blog.
Yeah. Martinez Perspective is the repository for all my articles, and then there's nonalignedmedia.com, which is my main blogging venue.
Okay, it is Martinez Perspective. I just had a misprint here.
That's fine.
I started saying it right. Okay, great. MartinezPerspective.com. Listen, you've done a number of I've been following your material on Non-Aligned Media and reading your stuff, and you've covered a number of provocative and very interesting issues. One is the issue of Putin and his perception in the West, particularly among the alternative media and maybe critics of Anglo-American foreign policy, and the tendency among those critical of Anglo-American foreign policy or the Atlanticist bloc or NATO to idealize Putin too much and maybe not
Right.
see him as some sort of virtuous standard bearer of all that is pure and right in the world.
Right.
And
Yeah.
you've called a number of these people out or criticized their views. And Putin, now obviously this is because what Putin appears to be opposing, which is the Atlanticist bloc, and sort of the this lunge forward by NATO since the end of the Cold War, and its reaction to NATO's aggression. But you've also made the point of that Putin also has a lot of skeletons in his closet coming from his background. Do you want to get into that?
Sure.
What does Putin represent, and to the West? Is he a real opposition, or is it something that we should be? I think someone we should be more skeptical of.
Well, I'm definitely of the view that we should be skeptical of Putin. Like you said, there's a growing trend within the anti-NATO crowd, the people who are critical of Western foreign policy, which I include myself in that. However, what we've seen develop over the past, especially over the past 2 years, I would say, is this unreserved fawning at the feet of Russia, is this worship, this hero savior mentality that's been enveloping much of the alternative media to the point where it's almost cult-like. You know, if you come out in any way criticize Putin for some of his past wrongs or even some of his activities today, you are considered an outcast. You are considered a heretic who should be shunned. And a lot of these people, some of them that I've known from past endeavors, have attacked me because of my stances on Putin, because I refuse to bow to this Putin, the white hat savior narrative, which on its face is ludicrous, just by virtue of the fact that the man sprung right out of the Soviet KGB system. So for anyone who's read about that history and has followed that whole era, the epoch in Russian history, you know that you cannot make it in the KGB system without being ruthless, without being opportunistic, conniving. How do you make it up the ranks through one of the most feared and murderous state security agencies in the history of the world, make it to the very top of that without being, a very, very nefarious kind of character who's willing to step on anybody to get to the top? So that's one point that just blows out of the water the idea that Putin himself is coming at this from a moral perspective. This is what I rebuke in these people. My argument is not that Putin is the worst guy in the world, is the worst politician in the world. Obviously not. But at the same time, the idea that he's a moral man, that he's motivated by ethics and moral principles, is patently absurd. And when you look at some of his early machinations in Russia, the way he came to power as Yeltsin's hand-picked successor, people rightly criticize Yeltsin for being a corrupt drunkard that he was, who handed off the whole country to these 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 oligarchs. and he handpicked Putin, and all of those people actually supported Putin initially, and it was a very, very dirty game that was being played there. To make a long story short, what they did is they grabbed Putin. They realized Yeltsin's time was up. He had no popularity in Russia. They wanted to put somebody else in there, so they picked Putin, who was the head of the FSB at the time, to succeed him. But the only way that they could do that was to draw the Russian public's attention away from all the rampant corruption involved with Yeltsin and the oligarchs in the Kremlin, and all of the looting that went on. So what they did was they orchestrated these terrorist attacks known as apartment bombings, which were used as an impetus to, one, start a war with Chechnya, the second war in a decade, which was a bloody and brutal war. And what it was designed to do ultimately was to take the public's attention away from the corruption in the Kremlin, put it on this war, put it on this external enemy. They created this external enemy image in a very similar way that the United States does with Al-Qaeda and these Islamic boogeymen that they've propped up and that are covertly working with themselves. And Russia did the exact same strategy, right? The false flag tactic of putting the attention on a scary external enemy to take attention away from corruption. And this led to Putin's rise to power. He seized upon that as his casus belli to elevate himself to power. He started talking tough, like he's this tough leader who's going to crack down on terrorism and so forth. And then we look into it in the apartment bombings. There's a plethora of evidence and work out there showing that those were false flag operations conducted by the FSB, which Putin was the head of just before those happened. They caught Russian FSB agents planning a bomb in a building, and about 2 days after that, they started bombing Chechnya. They instantly pointed the finger at the Chechens, like you'd expect with a false flag, the instant assignment of blame to the enemy without an investigation. And when some principled Russian lawmakers started to probe into that terrorist bombing, they started to drop like flies. They started dying. Many Russian politicians in opposition parties who began investigating those apartment bombings and all of the aspects surrounding the Chechen war started to get killed, literally hitman style, gunned down in the streets, which I cover in one of my articles on Putin. And in that, they used those bombings to divert the attention and start the war, which Putin, of course, rode that wave of righteous indignation to power. So we're seeing very much the exact same strategies and tactics that the West has used in its wars of aggression being employed by Putin, and then we take that further into the 21st century with the war on terror, and we learn that Putin was one of the first guys to call Bush after 9/11, pledge his support to the war on terror, and offer Russian assistance in the war in Afghanistan. I document that thoroughly. So people, when they talk about Putin, they start the clock at the year around 2008 or so, when he started to butt heads with the West, right, over the Georgia situation and a few other areas. Putin starts to butt heads with the West. But you look deep into his history, we find that originally, he was trying to secure his seat at the globalist table through teaming up with America in this phony, bogus war on terror. There's a lot of similarities between Russia and the U.S. policy and Israeli policy. In fact, the Israelis were ecstatic about Putin's policies towards Chechnya because it's similar to what they're doing in Gaza, and they make almost identical arguments and talking points to justify their violence against those people. So Putin was neck deep in corruption and evil in his early days, and that's some of the things I'm talking about when I'm trying to make the point that Putin's not a moral man. But even in today's context, yeah, it seems like he's more and more pushing against NATO and its interventionist policies, somewhat to some extent, but even then, it's not very consistent. You'll notice because he kind of signed off on that NATO intervention in Libya, didn't really do anything to stop that. I quoted some of his statements from early in the 2000s where he was saying things like he doesn't need evidence that Osama bin Laden was involved in 9/11. He will just take for granted that the American story is true. I mean, he said that. He said he doesn't even require evidence. And then in 2011, someone asked him about 9/11 and said, do you think it was an inside job, a false flag? And he rebuked that strongly and said, no, no way. False flags, intelligence agencies don't do things like that. And I kind of tied that into his history of false flag terrorism. I mean, it makes more sense that he takes that position on 9/11 when you look at his involvement in such activities himself and his early collaboration with the U.S. and and going along with that agenda and that narrative. So it makes more sense when you bring those things into context. But even in today's world, we see he's intervened in Syria to some extent. But I don't really view that as evidence that he is committed to taking down the West. I mean, some of these grandiose theories, I think that they just do not fit reality. They're fanciful thinking, because this idea that Putin, he doesn't even have the power to take down the West, let alone the interest in doing so. He wants to work with the West when he can, which is why he's always saying in his interviews, our American partners, our Western counterparts, our partners, blah, blah, blah. So he wants to work with them. He has disagreements with them. Russia and China have some disagreements with them on some foreign policy issues, but there are other issues where they're in complete lockstep with one another. For example, the Second World War issue, the West and the East, the victorious powers of World War II, they have come together in stamping out any sort of revisionism about the Second World War, because they're the victors. They want to uphold their fabled version of events, so they have to stop any skeptics and critics of that. And we've seen Putin put in place a Holocaust denial law and a similar edict saying you can't criticize Stalin and the Red Army for their activities in World War II. China has similar laws. Of course, these powers were allied with the U.S. and Britain and France and the Allied powers in the Second World War. So there's many points of agreement. There's some points of disagreement. But one thing I wanted to mention with the NATO and a lot of these critics of Western foreign policy are always talking about NATO's expansion and so forth, which is true to some extent. However, if you look at the context of the whole Cold War situation, yes, NATO is expanding, but the Soviet Union, let's not forget, the Soviet Union expanded deep into Europe. It conquered half of Europe after World War II. Stalin waltzed in, which was his ultimate plan, was to let Germany and Britain and France fight each other to the death, and then Stalin planned to swoop in and enslave these countries to Bolshevism, which is what he did. He took over half of Europe and East Germany. Most of Central Asia came under Soviet rule. Communism was exported to China, to Vietnam, to North Korea, to all these other areas. The Soviet Union had the Comintern, right, which was a body that was promoting international Marxism all over the world, sponsoring red mercenaries to create insurrections in various countries to establish Marxist governments that would be allied with the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union absolutely was an imperialistic power, pushing not only its ideology but its military power over its surrounding regions. So it was the biggest country in the world, right? The Soviet Union was the largest landmass on Earth, not because they're goody two-shoes, but because they were a brutal empire. So I find a lot of the discourse around the Soviet Union, this romanticization of the Soviet Union by a lot of these kind of leftist anti-imperialists, they're just ignoring huge swaths of history of Soviet atrocities as well. We can condemn NATO atrocities and Western atrocities, but that doesn't mean that the Soviet Union is somehow the white hat good guy. Just because they didn't intervene, let's say, as much as NATO did. Like the United States invaded Vietnam and bombed Laos and Cambodia and did these kind of far off wars in these far off lands. The Soviet Union didn't do as many of those. However, they didn't need to, because they had already conquered half of Europe, Central Asia, and much of its surrounding regions. It didn't need to just branch out that far. It was just it took the approach more of funding covert revolutionaries, which the U.S. did as well in Latin America and so forth. But we're seeing this kind of polarizing narrative developing of good versus evil. It's like the West is evil and the East must be good, right? Take your pick, one or the other. It's either you're with the Atlanticist NATO power or you're with the BRICS Eastern New World Order, right? There's two kind of competing factions, but they're both, in my opinion, they're both bad, they're both evil, they both don't present real alternatives. That's why I call my website Non-Aligned Media, right? Because I took my principles sort of stemming from the non-aligned movement. I don't want to be aligned to any big power. I don't want to bend to the will of Russia or China or the United States or Zionism or any of these power blocks. They're all corrupt. They're all evil in their own ways, some worse than others. So that's some of the things I was talking about.
Mhm. Now, with Putin, regarding Putin, you get a sense, when he's disregarding or saying that theories regarding 9/11 an inside job, and saying that you shouldn't even consider that because that's just outrageous. Intelligence agencies don't do such things. I think at a certain level, intelligence agencies are all kind of they hang out together, and so there's an understanding
Right.
at that level that these things are done, and it just isn't talked about in public.
Right. I
you
think
know,
they have like a gentleman's agreement
yeah, and
where they don't unearth each other's dark
yeah,
secrets.
CIA knows what the dirty things the Mossad does, and Mossad knows what the dirty things the CIA does, and FSB or Soviet intelligence. They all kind of knew what they were doing, and it's in its own way it was their own little game they were playing, and everything else was kind of like collateral damage at that level.
They all have dirt on each other and
Yeah,
they all have blackmail material on each other. So if Putin came out and started criticizing the U.S. government's narratives on the war on terror and various false flag attacks, then they would just whip out this apartment bombing stuff
yeah,
and start exposing him. So he can't really afford to do it because his whole career is built on a pile of bones and blood himself. So on that level, he's compromised. On that level, how can he not be controlled by the powers that be? They could expose him at any time and overthrow him, but he's managed to hold on to power for 16 years, and that's also suspicious. If he was really some grand opponent of everything that we see the West and the globalists doing, or these roundtable groups, then why is Henry Kissinger friends with Putin, right? Why is Berlusconi, that corrupt politician from Italy, why is he best buddies with Putin? Why is Nicolas Sarkozy, corrupt scumbag from France, NATO stooge, a Zionist fanatic, why is he Putin's mouthpiece in Europe? Literally, he is the advocate for Putin in Europe, who's saying that we need to work with Russia. So I think we see somewhat of a split in the elite, where there's some who don't like some aspects of Putin, but there's some who say that he can work with us. We can work with him. He should have a seat at the table. So I think there's probably a bit of a split within the elite of the West about Putin, because he's not completely 100% on board with everything that they want, right? But he is on board with many things that they want, and he's of course in lockstep with all the phony narratives about terrorism, about World War II. He supports all those narratives. So I think to look to him as a grand revolutionary who's going to struggle and crusade against the New World Order, this is a fantasy. This cannot be proven to be true.
and one way to look at it is maybe look at it maybe the five families of New York, how you have maybe competing factions in a criminal game, in a criminal enterprise, and there might be real divisions and real disagreements among these elites, but nevertheless the story that's retailed to the public is false.
Right.
Yeah, so
Right, and same goes for Russia itself. There's different factions, and just
mhm.
like in any country, there's factions of the elite who have fights, who have disputes and feuds, just like you saw with Stalin and Trotsky. Right, you had that whole Stalin-Trotsky feud. All the Trotskyites and people loyal to Leon Trotsky were chased out of the Soviet Union by Stalin. They're both communists, but they had disagreements, maybe some ideological disagreements, but mostly just power disagreement. Stalin wanted to control the country, and Trotsky wanted to control the country, and Stalin won out. That doesn't mean Trotsky's good, does it? No,
Mhm.
Trotsky was a mass murderer himself. So this is the kind of thinking we see now developing. And it's myopic, very one-sided thinking that if somebody is being like maligned in the media or something, that must mean they're good. That doesn't work either, because if we're going to take that argument that because the Western mainstream media is bad-mouthing Putin on some things, that means he must be on our side, he must be good. Well, the Western mainstream media is also bashing ISIS 24/7, aren't they? They're rolling out the red carpet of ISIS's atrocities 24/7. Does that mean we should embrace ISIS? You know, that it's silly. It's a silly argument. I mean, they basically the mainstream media's critiques are not my critiques of Putin, right? I don't portray the same analysis. I critique him. My yardsticks for critiquing him are much different than the mainstream media. And the mainstream media just does what the governments tell them to do. So when Putin is cooperating on different issues, you'll see that the mainstream media uh, diminishes its criticism. At some points they completely wipe out that criticism. Like in the early days when he was cooperating with the war on terror, there was basically no criticism of Putin and some of Russia's atrocities in Chechnya. So it's just a game that's being played. That we see different little factions fighting each other, even within the U.S. establishment. You know, you have the neocons who are basically Zionist Israel firsters, who didn't like a war, didn't see a war they didn't like in the Middle East. But then you have like Brzezinski and these other realists who don't like the neocons, who don't think we should be in the Middle East, who think we should be focused on curtailing Russia and China and so forth. So there's splits even within the Americans. It doesn't mean that Brzezinski's good just because he's not a neocon, right? So this is the kind of thinking what we see, and I think it's incumbent upon people who have a clear head on this and can see the bigger picture and can analyze this properly to speak out against this Putin worship, because it is pervasive. I mean, it is everywhere you go. I mean, these people show up on my if I do an interview and I criticize Putin anyway, I'll have like 50 trolls come on and say, "You work for NATO, you work for the CIA," right? It's just a
Yeah.
circus show almost.
And it's interesting the point we mentioned Trotsky. Of course, Trotsky's escape to the West, and the Trotskyites in the West, they became the neoconservatives, who were largely behind at least the latter stages of the Cold War. They took over the Republican Party, the conservative Republican Party, in the 70s and 80s. And
Right.
many of these people were committed Trotskyites, and it wasn't based on any committed idea towards individual liberty or rule of law or free market. Is they sort of infiltrated themselves into the power structures of the West, the political party,
Right.
and I guess after Vietnam they had to go to the Republican Party because the Democratic Party became, I guess, somewhat more isolationist in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and they
Yes.
yeah
Yes. That's precisely what took place. So they employed the entryist technique, which was a Trotsky technique, where they embed themselves in a competing political group or ideology and try to steer them covertly into their own camp. So they'll call themselves something that they're not, right? So the neocons call themselves conservatives, but they're not conservative, and all of their policies are uh, very radical, which cannot be considered to be conservative. So that was what those people did, but it just shows the disconnect with some of these Putin worshippers, where they adopt this like pendulum swinging way too far in the other direction. So they'll say like, or some people even do that in the opposite way. So there'll be like people who say, oh well, during the Cold War, the United States was demonizing all these Soviet politicians, perhaps even Stalin to a certain extent. Does that mean Stalin is good? The guy who killed 30 million people? Like, this is the kind of false dichotomy that we're presented with oftentimes in these political debates. It's the new Cold War. It's the Cold War 2.0. It's splitting the entire world into East and West. You choose a side. And my only point was that I don't want to be part of either side. I want to take my own side, or the side of the common people, against these criminal elites of both the East and the West. But one point on Trotsky, I think that might give us an entryway to another topic, is those guys, Trotsky and his followers morphed into neoconservatism, as you said, hijacked the Republican Party, very much took over the U.S. foreign policy under Reagan, and then under Bush, most firstly under George W. Bush, concocted the whole war on terror, created 9/11 as the new Pearl Harbor to kick off this century of war against the Islamic world, which we're seeing dovetailing into this phony civil war in Syria, which they've covertly sponsored through funding, arming, and training the various militant groups, rebels, and mercenaries that they first used to oust Gaddafi and then redirected them and the weapons into Syria and have been fueling that ever since. And a ton of documentation has come out detailing that Western powers, Israel and their NATO stooges in the region, especially in the Gulf region, have sponsored this thing that calls itself Islamic State. It is a creation of these Western powers of Israel as per the Oded plan of fracturing all of Israel's enemies in the Middle East. So all of this is sort of metastasizing right now. What we're seeing is a final phase of this where, Wesley Clark came out with the 7 countries in 5 years. He said that the neocon plan after 9/11 was to take down Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Sudan, Iran, and Lebanon, I believe. Now, almost all of those countries have been destroyed. Sudan was broken into 2, right? If you remember, in 2006, through a U.S.-Israeli-sponsored separatist movement. The Christians in the South were backed by the West, and they destroyed that country. Afghanistan and Iraq were gutted after 9/11. Now Syria is being destroyed through a civil war. Libya has been completely dismantled and dismembered through a Western-backed inspired insurgency there to remove Gaddafi from power. So basically all you have left is Iran and Lebanon, which are both being pegged as the next targets of this whole ISIS thing. So they've been quite successful in that whole policy, right? And it works into the neocons. They're Zionists first and foremost, and I've done a lot of work on that issue, but it comes out of that Leon Trotsky Marxist school, as you said, which also gave birth to cultural Marxism, right, which has enveloped much of the West today. So what I've been trying to emphasize lately on my site is, I've focused a lot on the Middle East and Western foreign policy and the Zionist neocon agenda and the Oded Yinon plan for breaking down and fracturing all these Middle Eastern countries, which they're continuing to do. But now what they're also doing is they're mobilizing the consequences of their imperial wars, namely the refugees that they've created by destabilizing and bombing the hell out of these countries. And now they're using the refugees as further cannon fodder for what I call the second agenda of these Zionist, neocon, Trotskyist, cultural Marxists, and that's to, of course, destroy the West as well, to weaken, undermine Western countries.
This is demographic warfare.
Right. It is, and it's completely orchestrated. This isn't something that just happened, that just magically, created itself. This is a clear, very, very orchestrated and defined strategy of breaking down societies, creating internecine warfare through the movement of populations, mass movement of populations, especially into Europe now, dovetailing with the migrant crisis. The migrant crisis is what I call the pinnacle of a long-standing strategy of covert and even overt ethnic or cultural warfare against Western countries. So there's a lot of focus put on the Middle East, and I've covered a lot of the Middle East stuff over the past few years. There tends to be an ignorance, though, on the part of many who sort of fancy themselves as anti-Zionists or anti-imperialists, which I also consider myself to be. But there seems to be an ignorance on that end towards some of the nefarious goings on with regards to what the West and the strategies that have been employed to break down these societies in a similar way that they're doing to the Middle East, but more so under the surface, more so in terms of propaganda. Right? It's not a physical war. There's not bombs falling on Berlin anymore. But the war in this case is a cultural one. It's done through media propaganda and academic campaigns, which have been usurped to a large extent by this cultural Marxist phenomenon. Right? This this ideology of cultural Marxism was, birthed through the the cultural Marxist brain trust known as the Frankfurt School, right? Which was these radical Marxists that existed in Germany. They were intellectuals, and they functioned in some universities in Germany until Hitler kicked them out in the 30s. They ended up burrowing their way into the universities in the United States, gaining control.
Like Columbia and things like that.
Yeah, many of the big universities became sort of the meeting centers and the policy centers for these cultural Marxist intellectuals. And the fact is that they are effectively just another offshoot of the Trotsky neoconservative camp.
This is Adorno, Wilhelm Reich.
Right.
Think of the other one.
Yeah, those guys.
Yeah, and Wilhelm Reich was more like the sexual revolution stuff. He understood that if you undermine the community's sexual mores and values, you could change the political constitution. It would fall into your lap. And
right.
Yeah.
So they spawned all of that sexual revolution stuff from the 60s, right? The whole hippie drug culture. They pushed that stuff. Mm-hmm. They are promoting dysgenic policies, right? Things like feminism, things like mass immigration, things like the LGBT craze.
But didn't they also align themselves kind of like with the foundations and the Rockefellers, which is kind of like a WASP Jewish alliance working here?
I think in some ways there was the sort of WASP elites that cast away any kind of ethnic or cultural identities, right? These were capitalists first and foremost. People like the Rockefellers and other. They're not committed to any kind of culture or history or ethnicity or anything like that. They are just capitalist opportunists who allied with these predominantly Jewish Zionist elites and bankers and financiers, people like George Soros, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Schiffs, and so forth. These people were the money men behind a lot of these foundations.
And Schiff was the one that bankrolled Trotsky.
Absolutely. He bankrolled Trotsky, sent him to Europe, sent him to Russia to foil communist takeover of Russia, and then he got kicked out, and then they sprung all of these other movements in North America. So they were bankrolling this stuff, and their main goal, so to a large extent, we should point out that the majority of these cultural Marxists from the Frankfurt School are Jewish Zionists who have this ideology of hatred towards Western Christendom, you could say, or just Western culture to a certain extent, largely rooted about persecution of Jews. They believe Jews were persecuted in Europe. Oftentimes that's exaggerated, but they believe that stuff, right? They believe their own lies and they believe their own propaganda, and they fall victim to their own propaganda. So these kind of paranoid lunatic intellectuals that populate this Frankfurt School and the cultural Marxists, they're hell-bent on just tearing down the fabric of Western culture, Western societies, Western civilization by promoting dysgenic policies, mass immigration, LGBT, all these unnatural things, feminism, all these things are designed to destroy the family unit, to destroy traditional relationships, to destroy traditional gender roles. So now we're seeing this phenomenon of the transgender and all these weird cultural phenomena that never existed before this time. This stuff is brand new, right off the shelf. Like, we never heard of this stuff, and in some cases they're mobilizing towards normalizing pedophilia. I mean, there's groups out there promoting pedophilia and the rights of pedophiles. I mean, this is the kind of sickening degeneracy that we see being.
And what they do with the media is they sexualize children through the media, and when children manifest that sexualization because they've imbibed this media, say, look, children are sexual, so therefore it's okay.
Yeah. So they've orchestrated it from both ends. Yeah. They've orchestrated the sexualization of children and this disgusting propaganda where they have like 8-year-olds prancing around like strip club dancers in music videos, and then on the other end are using their own propaganda to normalize and in some cases even try to legalize pedophilia.
Oh, yeah, I
So
mean, Jeffrey Epstein, the scandal
right.
we've had down here, of course, is not being reported on because it involves some household names, political names in this country, like Bill Clinton and Larry Summers
And
um,
Dershowitz.
and Alan Dershowitz. I think Erhard.
People are sick.
Uh,
These
yeah,
elites,
but
these
one of his friends is the owner of I forget what store, girls' clothing store, but they do clothing for kids, and the clothes for kids have become for girls has become overly sexualized.
right.
It's hard to find a decent bathing suit anymore for a girl, for a young girl. And so again, a lot of the stuff I mean, really, it's like full spectrum dominance. It's the media, it's entertainment, it's fashion, and it's hard to believe it isn't. It is at one level, it isn't coordinated. You know, so.
Sorry, you're cutting out a bit there.
Oh, I'm
Can
sorry.
you hear me okay? Can
Yeah, I
you
can
hear
hear
me
you.
okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear
Yeah,
me okay?
I can hear you now that the signal was dropping out
Oh,
there a little bit.
I was just saying that fashion about Jeffrey Epstein, a friend of Jeffrey Epstein. I forget what store he owns, but I was listening to an interview.
Right.
But it caters to young women, and also they have one for kids. Talbots.
Hmm.
They have tablets for girls and tablets for kids, and how the clothes for the kids have become. I mean, for like pre
Right.
has become
Pre-
sexualized,
Yeah,
and
so
you know,
it's a cultural phenomenon that's being deliberately promoted by the media establishment, by Hollywood, by the music industry to create the desired effect, and then they use their own propaganda to legitimize all these other nefarious things that they are also supporting and promoting behind the scenes, right? So all of this kind of today with mass immigration, migrant crisis, this circus show of feminism and pro pedophilia and this LGBT craze, these transgender fanatics and lobbies that are popping up. This is a deliberate campaign to destroy and tear out the roots of Western civilization, Western culture, to destroy ethnicities, and all this is designed towards um, removing the barriers that prevent globalism from fully realizing itself, right? So globalism wants to create a global slave plantation, open borders, no borders, and things like spirituality, things like tradition, culture, race, ethnicity, these things stand in the way of a global government. These things stand in the way of the mass movements of populations because people who are deeply rooted in ethnicity or culture or tradition or other concepts, they won't put up with this. They won't support this. They won't of these Zionist globalists who want to create this kind of world where we're all just acculturated plebs. None of us have any roots, identities, attachments. We're just ripe fodder for the globalist slave plantation, the globalist shopping mall, where all we care about is material possessions and consumer issues and popular culture and entertainment. That is the world that they have physically created here in North America, which is the worst of the worst in terms of
hmm
these globalist havens that they've established. America and Canada, where I live, these places are decrepit, decaying societies where there's no culture, there's no real history. They succeeded in pushing these concepts, these cultural Marxist spawned concepts here. They've really won the day here. And a part of the problem, I think, part of the reason that they're so successful in North America as opposed to Europe, for example, is because these two countries, Canada and America, are fairly new countries, right? They don't have a big history, a long history. The culture was very divided to begin with because uh, the original founding peoples of these countries had their own cultures. However, those cultures kind of withered away with the movement of many different cultures within Europe moving into North America. So you had different kinds of Europeans move in, and that was kind of multiculturalism in itself. And then that expanded out. They just sort of built upon that idea to incorporate the entire planet, and now they're like moving like half of Pakistan and Africa into the West, right? So they've been able to exploit those ideas and those circumstances to produce what we have today. And Canada, just for so many reasons, is just it doesn't have the potential for a unified country, and it didn't really have the roots for it during the foundation of the country. So they've been able to just turn these countries into shopping malls, gigantic shopping malls with plebs who spend all their money on entertainment and junk. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to focus more on Europe and salvaging the real rooted cultures, peoples, and countries of Europe, because they actually have a lot more to hang on to in many respects, and that's some of the stuff I've been covering lately with the migrant crisis deal more with Europe, because I feel it's easier to explain why we should preserve those cultures and societies as opposed to North America, because I think it's just at this point it's very beaten down and decrepit, these places.
In in the United States, of course, we had in the middle of the 20th century, the creation of suburbia through the construction of the interstate highway system, and also the destruction of urban neighborhoods that were ethnic based. A lot of them were Catholic, and this was a plan to create a dispersal into the suburbs and create sort of a deracinated, bland white middle class that was homogenized and all the same. So, right. In a sense, and that's not really in dispute. If you do that's what happened. It was part of a military contingency planning and also a broad social engineering scheme hatched by the WASP elite and the Jewish elite.
Right.
Because one thing, they were very skeptical of Catholic power that was growing. In fact, it was illustrated in the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960, and that might have factored into his murder 3 years later.
Right.
But he. Or what happened was you create, what you're describing are people that are deracinated, they're cut off from their roots, and
right.
once they're cut off from their ethnic roots, their religion, their cults, so to speak, what their people, they can be subjected to the psychological warfare that Hollywood and Madison Avenue has to offer, and that is that's sort of like post-war America right there, wouldn't you say? I mean,
right, and that's part of the cultural Marxist Frankfurt School doctrine, because many of them, almost all of those guys, are very strongly identifying Jewish supremacists, I would say. So they maintain their history and culture, and they're even racialists in Israel, and promote they promote their own, and they want to build up the strongest of their people, but then they promote these policies in the West that is designed to elevate the weakest elements of society to the top, right? These weirdos, these odd people, weak people, that's why they piggyback on all these minority causes and LGBT and the gay rights and Black Lives Matter and so forth. So they're promoting all these kind of dysgenic policies, emboldening the weakest elements of Western societies in order to destroy, deracinate, dethrone the majorities, because these Jewish supremacists are paranoid about majorities, right? So whenever they're the minority, they hate the majority. They're always in fear and loathe the majority and seek to weaken and destroy them. Like, I don't hate Jews, but I criticize their insane policies and their insane paranoia, which they've created themselves by fabricating history to make themselves look like the victims. And it's not even just the West that is a target of this. So in the Middle East, the neocon Zionist agenda is obviously overt warfare, but it's also a cultural Marxist sort of critique of the Islamic world, right? So these neocons and these Ziocons are always bashing and critiquing Islam and Islamic culture, and they're highlighting and myopically emphasizing the faults of Islam and the Islamic cultures, that they're mean to women and they're mean to gays, etc. They're pushing that there too. So they're promoting cultural Marxism within the framework of neoconservatism against the Islamic world, also doing it towards the West, and then they're pitting each group against each other in this phony clash of civilizations, culminating in the migrant crisis by feeding Europe with an endless stream of Middle Eastern, predominantly Muslim migrants, and then they're getting their media to focus only on Islam. They want us to bash only Islam and attack Islam, and not talk about the overarching strategies, the string pullers, the overseers who are guiding all of these policies, who conceived these policies, wrote them down at their roundtable groups and think tanks. Okay, the migrants didn't create this migrant crisis themselves. They were uprooted through Western Zionist wars, and now they're being used as fodder to promote the destruction of Western cultures. And in Europe, there's a backlash against this, and a lot of these critics of the mass immigration and the migrant influx, they're being steered by the Zionists, right? So that they're being told, don't talk about the European Union, the origins of the European Union. Don't talk about the Kalergi Plan. Don't talk about cultural Marxism. Don't talk about Zionism. Don't talk about Israel. And only bash Islam. In fact, the BNP leader, Nick Griffin, he said that in 2007, a neocon, a group of neocons from the U.S. Tried to bribe him and told him, don't talk about the banking system or Zionism or Israel or Jews, or even the Jewish Zionist role in cultural Marxism. Only bash Islam. And that's where you have these phony kosher nationalist groups like the English Defense League and Pegida and all these phony Zionist-controlled fake nationalist groups who are springing up. They're getting all this funding out of nowhere. It's all coming from the same financiers, the same Zionist think tanks, the same neocons who are pushing all this. They are orchestrating this thing from both ends, right? They are pushing both sides against each other so that they can ultimately rise to the top at the end of this. They're getting their wishes in the Middle East with the destruction of all of their enemies, and they're using whites and Westerners and propagandizing the West to hate Islam and hate Muslims so that we want to go over there and fight them and destroy their countries for the benefit of Israeli empire. But at the same time, they're telling us they're telling us to hate them in Europe so that we can create civil war and fighting in Europe, where the string pullers who conceive these policies are just sitting in their penthouses. They're not worried. They're not concerned because we're sitting there fighting each other in the streets and not talking about the real issues. So when we talk about cultural Marxism or the Kalergi Plan, we have to identify what is the strategy here. Who are these people who are promoting this? And overwhelmingly, it just happens to be a fact that overwhelmingly these are Zionists. These are Jewish supremacists who have a messianic vision, who have a extremely paranoid view of the world, who think everyone and anything that's not Jewish is a threat to them that they need to destroy. So I mean, they are really the head of the snake of all of these movements. When I started looking into all these things, I was shocked myself to find how many times one of these subversive movements, you look at who's running it, who's defining its doctrines, who's benefiting first and foremost from its policies, and it just happens to be Zionists most of the time. That's just a fact. And if people are afraid to talk about that or to discuss it openly, then they're just being cowed by political correctness. They're just being duped, and they're just acting scared. And they really have you where they want you if you're not really talking about that.
Well, that's part of the psychological warfare, and part of that is control of the language. And when you get called an anti-Semite or even worse, something like a Nazi, for making some of these points, and that's part of the trick. It's part of the guilt that was put upon the entire West after World War II. It wasn't immediate. It occurred, it took decades. It really didn't pick up until the 70s, after the Six-Day War,
Right.
at least in the United States. And that's when they really started to flex their muscle, at least openly, here in the United States. But the Holocaust meme, a narrative which became dominant in the 70s, and that defined the Second World War. Um, but you make some excellent points here because you do when you talk about the destruction of European civilization, and you look back at the 20th century and the world wars in the past 20th century, and of course we get the comic book history to retell to us about what was the cause of those wars, whether it was a bullet finding Archduke Ferdinand, and all of a sudden the because of the alliances and the timetables on trains, and the war became automatic. But inside those wars, there's all types of intrigues. There's the issue of Zionism in Israel, and the Balfour Declaration, which was secured on the promise that Jewish influence in the United States would get U.S. into the war. Wasn't the only interest that got us into the war. There was the Eastern Seaboard financial elite who had bankrolled much of the Anglo-French war effort, but it definitely wasn't in the interest of the farm boys who went off and died in the hundreds of thousands in that war, or the millions that died in Europe. Well, of course, you have the Second World War. Is it your view that at some higher level that those conflicts were instigated to bring about what we're seeing today?
I think they're all part of a broader effort. And if we look at some of the intrigues behind World War I and World War II, I've written somewhat about this in some of my essays, which people can find in my book called Hidden History. And like you mentioned, the Balfour Declaration, most people have no clue what that is. And that's telling in itself that our history books have failed to identify a very prominent factor that was involved in instigating in some ways and proliferating or at least exacerbating those wars to serve the interests of this sectarian minority group that wanted to see themselves with a state at the end of these wars. So, with the First World War, there's a prescient quote from one of the Zionist leaders. His name was Max Nordau. He was one of the leaders at the Zionist Congresses. In 1903, he actually predicted World War I at the Zionist Congress. He proclaimed there's going to be a world war, and then he said that 6 million Jews would be victims of that war, would fall victim to this war.
Yeah, that number, right?
This Kabbalistic number. Yeah. So they already had this narrative, written. By the dawn of the 20th century, it was already there. They had it ready. They had it packaged. They just needed the circumstances that were necessary to be able to sell it to the public, to sell the idea that Jews needed their own state, needed their own homeland because they're persecuted. So they made up this narrative about 6 million Jews being persecuted, pushed the hell out of it in the media from the year 1900 forward. You had in the year 1900 on the dot, you had Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was the head of American Zionism. He came out and said there are 6 million living, bleeding, suffering arguments in favor of Zionism. Okay, laying out the entire agenda. 6 million suffering Jews, that will be the excuse, the argument, the casus belli, as it were, for Zionism, for creating a state for Jews. And then they started to push it in World War I. You had clippings of newspapers saying 6 million Jews are starving to death in World War I. All turned out to be exaggerated propaganda. Problem they had, though, with World War I is that there was no government in Europe that singled out Jews for persecution, right? That specifically named them and put them in camps or anything like that. But then they were successful with that with World War II, with Hitler. They were trying to provoke Hitler. They were doing the economic boycott that they started in 1933. Judea declares war on Germany. They did everything they can to exacerbate tensions between Germans and Jews because they wanted to uproot Jews from Europe to get them to go to Palestine. That was one of their big problems. They couldn't convince European Jews who were living comfortably, sort of living high on the hog, living the lap of luxury in Europe. How do you convince them to go to Palestine? You can't unless you uproot them through force, which Hitler basically did for them by putting them in camps, which they had pretty much consented to and collaborated with on a large scale. You find that there's books out there called The Transfer Agreement, Nazi-Zionist Collaboration, where the Zionists made secret agreements with Hitler to deport German Jews, tens of thousands of Jews, to Palestine to set up Israel. So many in Hitler's own party were critical of Hitler because he was not relenting on this transfer agreement policy. They kept telling him that this would be bad for German policy in the region and German interests in the Middle East, that they're going to alienate the whole Arab world by flooding Jews into Palestine. They don't want this. And Hitler just kept with the policy, perhaps in his short-sightedness, just wanting to get Jews out of Germany or what have you. But he unwittingly, or perhaps wittingly, some argue wittingly, but I would say unwittingly, fell into the trap that the Zionists had set for him in rounding up all these Jews, millions of Jews across Europe, putting them into camps, and providing the circumstances conducive to the propaganda narrative that they needed, absolutely needed, to be able to justify the ethnic cleansing, colonization of Palestine, and the Holocaust narrative. Without the rounding up in the camps, there is no Holocaust narrative. There's no Holocaust narrative. There's no excuse for what they're doing in Palestine. Even if with the Holocaust narrative, I say there's absolutely no excuse for what they're doing. Even if it's all true, there's no excuse for them to go and destroy another people in another land for something that happened in Europe, right? There's no excuse for what they're doing either way, but they've brainwashed much of the world to sympathize with them, to have feelings of guilt and feelings of that they need to repay them for what happened. So that's how they've convinced much of the world to back their murderous Zionist project. So that is a very central and fundamental aspect of the Second World War that cannot be divorced from it. But if you read normal history books, there's not one mention of the Balfour Declaration, of the transfer agreement, of the Zionists who were promoting this propaganda, inventing lies about 6 million, and all the stories that came before World War II. None of that is in the history books for obvious reasons, that they write the history. They edit and revise the history to suit their own interests. So we cannot believe anything that's written in there. So those things all, of course, tie in and absolutely lead to what we're seeing today. All of this propaganda that's been promulgated through the media in Hollywood about the Holocaust and the Jewish victimhood narrative of World War II is the fundamental foundation of cultural Marxism, was the driving influence behind a lot of those Jewish intellectuals in the Frankfurt School. They'll even say that and cite that in their books, that, you know, like the authoritarian personality. This guy was trying to critique and deconstruct, Western men and the authoritarian personality that led to people like Hitler coming to power and so forth. So they're a paranoid bunch of schizophrenics who are committed to destroying and tearing down anything that they view as a threat to them at some point. So they have to destroy manliness and masculinity because manly men turn into Hitlers, right? I mean, this is the kind of insanity that drives the cultural Marxism of the Frankfurt School. So there's a lot of anti-white narrative and propaganda that permeates the mainstream media, that permeates Hollywood, perhaps not to the same extent, I would say, as the anti-Muslim and anti-Arab rhetoric. There's that movie called Real Bad Arabs, where a guy, Jack Shaheen, documented 1,000 movies with Arab and Muslim characters, and 95% of the time they were portrayed in a horrible light, in a negative light, portrayed as terrorists and so forth. And of course, who benefits from that narrative? Well, Israel does, Zionism does, neoconservatism does. It's the same people behind both the anti-Arab stuff and the anti-white stuff, because they view both groups as an impediment to their domination and rule over these countries. They want to rule the world. They have messianic dreams of a global empire where everybody's subjugated, everybody's kneeling at their feet. These doctrines exist in their holy books. Not all Jews believe this. Not all Jews are guilty because of these lunatics who have the power and manipulate them too. They're manipulating their own people to believe these lies, to herd them like sheep, just as they're doing to us and the average plebs of our societies. So one of the things I posted recently was this video by the Red Ice Radio people deconstructing some of the anti-white propaganda. And you don't hear a lot of that talk on the anti-Zionist communities are kind of ignorant of a lot of that stuff because they're so focused on the Middle East. And then on the white nationalist or identitarian end, a lot of those guys are so focused on the West that they're ignorant of a lot of this foreign policy stuff, a lot of the stuff going on in the Middle East, and they're kind of ignorant of false flags. Not all these people, but some of them in those respective camps, because they're too focused on their own affairs. So I try to delve into both areas, get a big picture analysis. So that video did a good job of pointing out some of these phony studies that were done in the 40s about children were shown dolls, a black doll and a white doll.
Oh,
and they're told,
Kenneth Clark test, I think. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And they're told, pick a doll, and the results were not very consistent because half of them picked the white doll, half of them picked the black doll. And then this was sort of they were trying to prove that these kids are like inherently racist or something. Yeah, like they're just born racist. It was just absurd. And it's such a stupid thing because the kids make decisions based on a lot of things. Like the idea that they're picking the white doll because they're racist. No, they're picking the white doll perhaps because it just so happens that light colors tend to be more attractive. People like sunlight. They don't like darkness for a reason, because darkness is kind of scary, right? That's just a fact. That doesn't mean you're racist because you like light skin or light colors or blonde hair or whatever. So this idea that it's like it's a terrible thing, and the funny thing is like they are not critiquing those kids when they pick the black doll. Why can't we make the exact same argument that if you're picking the black doll, you're racist against whites? I mean, you can make the exact same argument on either end, right? But they're trying to shame whites, to shame people into this whole cultural Marxist narrative that if you're proud of your culture and history, if you're white, then that's racist. But if you're proud of your history and culture and you're black or you're native or you're Asian, then that's fine. That's okay. So we're seeing that phenomenon develop. It's widespread now. So you have all these groups springing up, these ethnic-based groups, right? Jewish groups, black groups. I mean, they just litter the whole environment of racial politics. Those groups are prominent.
And they're foundation funded, George Soros funded, and
Right, and they get media attention. They get a prime spot on the mainstream media to voice their views, their interests for their people. But then when there's some sort of white or European based group, the media demonizes it as racist. So the suggestion here, the implication here, is that you cannot be proud to be European in any way, or else you're racist. So these people are not anti-racist; they're just anti-white. When you look at their narrative, is they support all the ethno-activism of blacks, Jews, Latinos, Asians even, but then they demonize them when whites do it, which is a blatant double standard. So this is the point. The point is they are out to get whites and only whites. They're out to shame and discredit whites and promote these other ethno groups as sort of fodder in this kind of cultural ethno war that the cultural Marxists are waging against whites.
And a point here is that any of these progressive sounding ideas can be weaponized. That's one thing people have to remember, is that even issues like civil rights or integration can be weaponized, because forced segregation is wrong, but so is forced integration, because the operative word there is force. And the notion that any ethnically based community has to be integrated and destroyed to follow this fetish of integration, what you're saying is that people can no longer form communities, and the whole idea of community is the right of exclusion at some level. That's how you have communities, and people like attracts like, and people will form communities around people who they identify with. But the problem is, if you have people forming communities, then they start to communicate, start to become somewhat somewhat autonomous and free, and that's what because this goes back to your globalist, New World Order thing. They want to break down these distinctions because they want to make all these people kind of divided and only kind of divided and warring with each other. And this goes back to, I think Kevin MacDonald makes this in his thesis, is that they want to pretty much break everything down into little subgroups fighting amongst each other. Because one thing they don't like is a kind of a healthy, strong host culture.
Right.
And they want to make it weak, and that's what they've done. And I think they've, it's hard to say they, because a lot of these things are complex events, because the wars themselves involve a lot of interests and a lot of things with when you talk about the Balfour Declaration, obviously also involving British geopolitics and the British Empire, and why did the British Empire target Russia and Germany in the 19th and 20th century? And broadly speaking, and they got Russia to fight Germany, and that's all part of that Mackinder Doctrine and controlling the center, the sea power controlling the continental powers. So you have that intrigue, but you also have the strange sort of British Zio alliance, right, throughout the 19th century with Palmerston, and how, and also going back to Cromwell with it, like Amsterdam Jews funded Cromwell civil war against Charles I. So you really go way back in history in this stuff. So I mean, you really have to hit the books on this stuff to really understand what's going on today.
I think their tactic and strategy there has always been hijacking already existing spheres of influence, right? So infiltrating the British Empire, which already existed, and steering it towards their own interests and goals.
Would you say like the Rothschild family did that?
I think the Rothschilds are very prominent in that.
Yeah.
And other financiers, the Sassoons, who were prominent in promoting the Opium Wars of the British Empire, and the Oppenheimer family was fundamental in spawning those wars in South Africa, the Boer Wars, which were basically just wars to win the resources of that area for the Oppenheimer family and the Rothschilds.
And that's who Rhodes worked for, right?
Right, and then it's Cecil Rhodes. There's the Anglo element aligned with the Zionist Jewish banking element. There was this infiltration that happened, and then there's the propagandizing through Christian Zionism, British Israelism, and these movements, these ideologies that infected the British psyche, were promoted from the top down, obviously, by these British elites who got co-opted in a way. So that's the phenomenon that I've noticed, is that there are these powers that exist and have always existed. Empires have always existed in history, and they're all evil to a certain extent, regardless of who's running them, whether it's Jews or Catholics or Muslims or communist atheists. Empires do what they do. They want more resources, they want more land, etc. But what happens in a lot of these cases is it gets hijacked by Zionists and Jewish supremacists who have their own sectarian agendas, and it ends up making the empire do things that are, one, illogical, and even more destructive than they would have been normally. So in the case of the United States, the U.S. empire, as bad as it was under these realist, quote-unquote, foreign policy guys like Brzezinski, it's significantly worse under this Zionist neocon clique, because they're more crazy than Brzezinski. They're more imperialist. They're more interventionist. And they're more messianic. And they're illogical. So all those wars going on in the Middle East, the war on terror, this is all a Zionist neocon construction that would not have happened if Brzezinski was running the show. It wouldn't have happened. I mean, he opposed all those wars in the Middle East and condemned them as just aberrations from traditional U.S. policy in the region, because he's obsessed with Eurasia and controlling that area.
Yeah. The more the Rockefeller wing.
Right. He doesn't care about the Middle East.
Again, you're dealing with what we see there. We see the contours of different factions.
Right.
None of which are good, by the way. As
right.
you say, it's not like he's the good side.
Which tends to be the thinking of a lot of people, as if, the Zionist faction is terrible, but then they embrace some other corrupt faction that they think is a little bit less Zionist. So they'll be like, some of these people who try to exonerate Stalin, right? They say he, in his later career, like in 1950, he like took out or took down some of these Jewish communists in Eastern Europe, who he installed, by the way, after World War II.
Like the doctor's plot and things like that.
Yeah, there's the Slansky trials in Czechoslovakia, where like 11 of the 14 communist leaders of Czechoslovakia were executed, and 11 of them were Jewish. And then in Poland, the same thing. There was a purge that Stalin did, specifically targeting some of them were Jews. But the fact is that the guy was a mass murderer. So just because he took out some other evil dudes that he was working with does not exonerate him from all the evil in his past. Same with like Putin. They make similar arguments that he took out some other evil oligarch dude, so he must be good, even though he's a billionaire oligarch himself, is running Russia as a fiefdom, is opposed to any kind of entrepreneurship and business. He just seizes any business that it doesn't serve the state. He's almost bringing back communism to Russia. You'll notice, like he cracked down on a few oligarchs that he had a personal political feud with, not an ethnic feud. It wasn't him. He's an anti-Zionist and he took down these Jewish oligarchs. No, he did the same thing that Stalin did by kicking out Trotsky. Personal political feud based on power, not on ethnicity. He still had he banned Holocaust denial. He meets with the head of the Chabad Lubavitch sect, Burl Lazar, and this is one of his personal good friends in Russia. He jails people and he just passed a law against anti-Semitic biblical commentary. He shakes hands with Netanyahu. He does business deals with Israel. Gazprom, Putin's gas company, is running gas deals with the Israeli firms to build up their gas infrastructure, some of which is actually looted gas off the coast of Gaza and in the Golan Heights that Israel stole. So Putin is a supporter of Israel, supporter of Zionism, but he had a political feud with like 3 Jewish oligarchs, so therefore he must be the savior, right? So this is the kind of narrow thinking that gets pushed, and these analysts are very lackluster in their approach and don't really factor in a lot of things, right? It's just this black and white, good and evil battle.
But do you think the Russian people, as a political identity, as a group, kind of represent an obstacle to the New World Order, the Anglo-American elite, the Atlanticist? Not just Putin.
Well,
Putin is at the top. He's exploiting. He's clawed his way to the top. But as far as Russian civilization itself, what it represents.
Well, in a sense, all civilizations, whether it's Russian or European or Middle Eastern, or Islamic or African, or all these civilizations, it's to some extent, to the extent that they want to maintain sovereignty, they are a threat, right?
Yeah, and a good example, I've heard that like Russia never underwent a sexual revolution. They were because during the Cold War they were sealed off from the West. So some of the more destructive cultural trends of the post-war era, feminism, sexual revolution, this stuff, gay rights. So right. they haven't been completely demoralized, although they were demoralized in other ways under communism.
Right.
But as it turns out, it might have been the same forces, targeting different. You have to attack the West differently than you attack the East, But so now we're seeing with Russia sort of the cultural renaissance that occurred after '90s, which Putin got a lot of credit for. I think politically at home in Russia, they like their strongman.
Right, but Putin is just exploiting that.
Yeah.
He didn't conceive it. He was a communist in the KGB, and he said good things about Stalin and Lenin. And he just named a police force unit in Russia after Felix Dzerzhinsky, the head of the Cheka, the founder of the Cheka. So his strategy, which I've documented on my website, there's a good article about this, about Putin's PR man who comes up with a lot of this stuff. His strategy is to just play up to all the different factions in Russia. So it's the Christians, the traditionalists, to the Zionists in many cases. So he's just trying to extend the leaf branch to all these different factions so he can win support from them. He doesn't believe in that himself. He doesn't represent those values. He is an opportunist. So he was a communist when he was in the KGB, and now he's pretending to be a Christian, right? So he is just a political opportunist, a Machiavellian schemer who's trying to win political points with all these different groups. So I wouldn't credit Putin with that. That's
No,
the
yeah,
that's the credit of the Russian people for bringing back their that's reviving their culture, traditions, and so forth, which is a good thing in that limited sense. So in that sense, they're a threat as a people, not Putin himself or the political establishment in
yeah.
Russia. So people are confused, sometimes conflating those things when it shouldn't be conflated.
Well, people did it all the time in the West too. America, what is he? Is the America? Is it the U.S. government? What is America?
Right.
It's
Is
the people.
Obama America?
Yeah,
Like, is
yeah,
Putin Russia? No, Putin. If Putin was a true nationalist, he's not a nationalist. This is a false narrative. If he was a nationalist, he would hand off all those territories that were conquered by Russia back to those peoples. He would let them have self-determination and sovereignty, who aren't ethnic Russians, because Russia is historically an empire, right? It was called Imperial Russia. So they conquered all these regions around them, incorporated those peoples into the Russian empire, and a lot of them are not Russians, not Christians even. There's several million Muslims in the Caucasus that they conquered and rule. And Putin built his career on destroying the Chechen separatist movement, who wanted to have their own state and didn't want to be part of Russia because of the historical problems. Stalin deporting the whole Chechen population to the Gulag in 1944, for example. Yeltsin attacked them in 1994. So they wanted their own independence, and Putin ruthlessly stamped that out. But at the same time, he touts self-determination for the Crimea. He touts self-determination for Russian ethnics in eastern Ukraine, who he wants to draw back into the Russian Federation. So it's okay if you're a separatist who wants to join Russia, but if you want to leave the Russian Federation, you're
yeah.
a terrorist who needs to be killed. And he passed an anti-extremism law in Russia that says if you preach separatism from within Russia anywhere, you are an extremist who will be jailed. And he's used that to persecute people in Siberia, in northern Russia, and Karelia, which is a section of Finland that was stolen by Russia during the Winter War, which the Russians created through a false flag, through bombing one of their own cities and then blaming it on Finland. And they invaded Finland in 1939. So Putin is an imperialist. He represents somewhat of an imperial branch of the Russian elite who want to maintain this loose cosmopolitan framework and set up a metropolis sort of where they rule over all of these peoples that aren't Russians, right? So if he was a true nationalist, he would restrict Russia's borders to just ethnic Russians, right? And then he could proceed after that. But he doesn't do that. He wants to maintain control over regions that aren't Russian and expand further into Crimea, which NATO basically helped him do that. They gave him the pretext by helping this revolution in Ukraine, and which provided Putin with the necessary pretext to do what he wanted with Crimea, to take Crimea, which was not this referendum that he cited. That was just a pretext. He had planned to do that as soon as Yanukovych was overthrown. So I think NATO and Russia are kind of helping each other in a sense, because during the Cold War, you'll notice that the Americans justified all of their foreign policy gambits in Latin America and aggression in that region by saying that the Soviets were meddling, by saying that the Soviets were establishing communist bases in these countries. And it was true to a certain extent. You had Castro, a communist revolutionary, take over Cuba and basically open it up to the Soviet Union, allow them to put missiles there. Nuclear missiles, which the U.S. was putting missiles in Turkey, so it was a staged thing. But the point is that provided the American elite with the excuse to carry out their policies of coup and regime change and so forth in the region. But it also works on the other end, right? So Putin and the Russian elite during the Soviet times, for sure, they would cite NATO encroachment, so forth. They would kind of fearmonger and exaggerate somewhat about that to justify their aggression in their neighboring states, right? Putin does that now. He keeps saying NATO is sticking their nose in our backyard, so we have the right to like invade and annex Ukraine because otherwise NATO will take over. Right? It's just fear mongering on both ends, some truth to it, but fear mongering nonetheless to justify both imperialisms, and that was the Cold War. And now we're seeing kind of a reinvigoration of that same narrative, and they're both using it to their advantage. So I think on some level there's agreements between these two sides.
Yeah.
Because if you saw after World War II, Roosevelt actually said that we need a global order where the U.S., UK, Russia, and China will be the global police force. And isn't that what we have today with the UN Security Council?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that the framework and the model that we have? It's Russia, China, the United States, UK, and Israel, who's kind of puppeteering America behind the scenes, who are calling all of the shots for global issues. They're the decision makers. They have the judge's hammer, and they're making the decisions, and all the rest of us are just pawns in this bigger geopolitical game between these two powers. So I think it's dangerous for people to put hopes in Russia and China, these corrupt dictatorships. China is still a communist dictatorship. It just kills anyone who opposes them or criticizes them, have the worst possible laws on freedom, who commit genocide in Tibet and the Xinjiang region, and Russia does similar things in Chechnya. So they all have skeletons in their closet. They are not to be trusted. On some level, they're working together. You see China, gobbling up American debt. How would that be allowed? George Soros is singing the praises of China in many cases.
Yeah, the China America thing, it serves a lot of purposes. One thing, they finance a lot of debt, a lot of worthless dollars, and at the same time it deindustrializes the West and makes us addicted to all the little plastic crap consumerism goods they produce. At the same time, the economic model in China seems to be like the dream of the Rockefeller vision of what what economy should be.
Right, China's the worst of both capitalism and communism.
Red capitalism.
It's exactly what they have. They have capitalism somewhat for their elite, who use their people as slaves in these factories. They have suicide nets because their labor laws are like the worst in the world. And at the same time, they have the worst of communist authoritarianism, where they jail dissidents, kill dissidents, just have no freedom of association, no freedom of speech. That is one of the worst regimes out there, next to like Saudi Arabia in terms of internal politics. Maybe not on foreign policy; it's obviously better than America, but America is obviously far more free internally. So it's not a black and white issue, right? When people say America's foreign policy is probably the worst in the world, but its internal freedoms are far more substantial than any of these other countries that we're promoting as the white hats of this New World Order. So those are the phenomena that are sweeping the alternative media.
And one of the things that occurs, a lot of what's happened in China was you needed the turmoil and trauma of the Maoist period to create this modern China now, and you create by destroying their Chinese peasantry through all these wars and conflicts, you created a desperate mass that can work in the factories for cheap.
Right.
Same thing happens in Latin America too, or Africa for that matter. Usually Latin America, where now they're kind of creating these factories, or they say, well, these factories are the best deal that people can have because they're poor, otherwise they'd be unemployed. But they're unemployed. There's an unemployed urban mass because they've been forced off their ancestral homelands.
Right. I mean, they are targeting all these different areas in their own ways.
Mm-hmm.
The IMF, these globalist institutions are wreaking havoc in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. These globalist financiers are causing many problems economically for these countries, running sweatshops and these corporate cartels. So they're destroying all traditional cultures simultaneously, right? So it's not just the West that is the only victim of cultural Marxism. The Middle East, I say, is also a victim of it, the Islamic world. And all of these, we're all victims in a sense, in a way. So what I see happening now, I think that they might even be trying to shift their power base from the west to the east. So they're promoting this BRICS alliance of these corrupt dictatorships like Russia and China and India and Brazil and South Africa. None of these countries are ideal. I wouldn't want to live in any of those countries. However, they are building up this BRICS thing as like the savior of from the Western-led Atlanticist powers, right? So I think there might be some sort of dialectical strategy being employed here, where they're purposefully backing this BRICS thing and promoting it in the media, so that to hoodwink us into embracing that as the solution to globalism, right? As the solution to Western imperialism. So you see a lot of these dupes on the left are critics of Western imperialism are embracing Russian and Chinese imperialism as a counter to Western imperialism, right? So they're okay with China's vast economic influence in Africa now. They're okay with Russia annexing Crimea, and even some of them are calling for the annexation of Ukraine. So they're giving us a false choice. So the forces pushing up against the West ostensibly are just going to engage in the same things the West are doing. Who's to say 20 years down the road, Russia won't invade Iraq and take its oil for its own needs? I mean, if Russia and China are built up as these big powers who overcome America, who overcome these Western powers, they will just take their place at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no good empire. I mean, this idea that there's a good empire, no such thing, no concept has ever existed. All empires act the same or similarly at the end of the day. So I think we need to be wary of this and the people pushing this, because there's a lot of people that are just hammering that narrative out there that BRICS, Putin and Russia and China are the saviors, when I don't believe that they're anything of the sort.
Well, I think it was Vladimir Lenin who said the best way to control the opposition is to become the opposition. And of course, Lenin himself, turns out,
Right.
was controlled opposition. Yeah.
He's the epitome.
Yeah, Western finance backed. So,
Right.
and that's one of those things where, yeah, it's where you turn, there's no hero out there. No, I guess in terms of Putin, there's no shirtless man on a white horse coming to save you. You know.
Right. It's all
So,
designed in a way to take power away from the individual. It's you're acting like you can't do anything yourself. You can't build your own communities and come up with your own solutions to problems. Just, put all your eggs in the Putin basket. Let him take the reins of this ship and let him direct it in whichever way he wants. Like, give him the power and let him do what he wants, and he'll save us. Just put your faith in him. It's like a Christ-like Messiah scenario here, where we just have to just submit, forgo any inclinations that we have or power ourselves, and give it to this oligarch in Russia or this dictator in China who will save us all from evil. Right?
yeah. Well, listen, Brandon, I've had you a little past than I said I would, so I'm going to let you go tonight. I want to thank you for coming on and spending so much time with me tonight to talk about these things. Again, we could talk for hours about these various topics. So whether it's Putin or white nationalism or anti-white bias, these things. Again, I think I agree with a lot of the stuff is designed to create a dialectic, and the action is in the reaction. You have to be very careful. I was talking. A while back, I interviewed D. Michael Jones. We were talking about the some of these racial issues and integration of the 20th century, and even what's going on in Europe. And he said the big mistake people make is when they're dealing with something like this is to blame their immediate perceived enemy. And I think you alluded to that. We have to look at who's pulling the strings and why it's being done. And the idea of demographic warfare or weaponized migration isn't some sort of crazy conspiracy theory. It's been written up. I think Kelly Greenhill wrote a book called Weapons of Mass Migration. And it's about that very strategy, weakening a country by subjecting it to mass migration. So it's it's written about in academia. It's a part of strategy. It's a part of warfare.
That's right.
But listen, that's Brandon Martinez from Non-Aligned Media. His blog is martinezperspective.com. His books are Grand Deceptions and Hidden History, and go to his website, Non-Aligned Media, and he has a lot of a lot of videos up, articles, and you can spend of weeks there, just consuming and taking in the information there, and forming your own opinions. It's provocative, it's interesting stuff, but I think it's definitely good stuff.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's great speaking with you.
Yeah, thanks again for coming on again tonight, and we'll talk again in the future, hopefully.
Definitely.
And be careful up there in Canada. I know you don't have the right of free speech up there, so.
That's right. That's right. I'll be in the gulag in any minute.
Yeah, we still have it down here supposedly. So.
Wow. Not if they have their way.
Yeah. So, listen. Thanks and good night.
Good night.